So welcome back, friends, to a bittersweet video on the channel. So yeah, I may have been looking for an excuse to get out of that hateful remodel for the last 10 days or so, and Mrs. W has provided it for me today. So she always comes upon these things before I do because she runs around her trail on our property. And we've had another windfall. Do you know where windfall started? I'm not sure. I remember reading something years ago about, I think it came out of England. Do not all good things come out of England? Jellied eel and blood pudding and soccer hooligans and anyway, so in England, if you were a private landowner or a gentleman, where the term came from, gentleman, had nothing to do with being a good guy, it just meant that you were a man of property, a propertied man, a man of substance. A gentleman, during times of war, even though they may have had timber on their own land, it belonged to the king. And the war effort primarily building the siege weapons and engines of war in the shipping industry. So if you couldn't harvest but a certain allotment, right? You couldn't just clear cut the whole thing and sell it for personal profit. It belonged to the king, unless something that there was maybe an act of God or what they called a windfall, a wind event that would push a tree down. If the tree was on the ground from a windfall, well, it was yours to claim. So I wonder how many teams of horses with long ropes created their own windfalls back in the day, I would imagine. And also this windfall here is on our neighbor's property, which happens to be a giant timber company. And so what are the ethics of a windfall? What happens if your neighbor's tree falls on your property, does damage to your trees? Does it still belong to him? Are there reparations? I guess the way I would look at it is that if his tree falls on my property and tears up some of my trees, well, the compensation comes from me keeping the tree and cutting it up for firewood, right? I don't know. Seems the reasonable progression of things. But let's take a look at it, see if we can figure out what killed it. Up to the top of the tree, this is probably a 70-year-old Douglas fir. This top, if we can find it, will have been over 100 feet in the air. There it is right there. That would have been the top of the tree. And you can see that it is indeed very dead. It's got a lot of what appear to be beetle holes, beetle kill in there, and the wood is very dry. Nothing green on it. There's the rest of the top. There, so that split off and kind of piled up on itself. So dry was it that it's broken here at the tip. And again, no foliage. All of these green boughs you see here, these are, of course, beautiful Douglas fir. There's a Douglas fir cone right there. The smell is, I wish I could share the smell. Have been stripped off from my own tree there. That's a little guy, a little brother to this tree that fell, probably about a 25-year-old, and didn't do it any good. Barked its knuckles, as my granddad used to say. And completely stripped off every branch on one side. Gave it kind of a tree mohawk there going on, but I think that will survive. It's a pretty good sized tree. People ask me why I often wear a hard hat in the forest. Well, it's not going to stop a tree like that, but it's certainly going to help if a big branch hits you on the head, right? Saw a guy in a wildland fire 3 years ago who had upgraded his helmet with his own money to one of the new carbon fiber helmets. He was a faller. A big branch came down about so big and actually put a hole through that helmet alongside of his head. And he lived. He had that helmet. He was packing it around, showing all of us. Had he not upgraded that helmet, there's no way, in my opinion, that plastic one would have survived that type of a blow. But here's where it failed. So you can see behind me there, that's the stump. That's probably about 12, 13 feet up there, and it just broke off completely. After standing there for 70 years, it just broke off all of a sudden in that last windstorm we had, and then jumped over the fence to right here. Let's take a look and see what we have. So these are dangerous trees. That's why I'm always talking about the dangers of snags, because they can look like viable trees. They call them the silent killers. Almost every year, firefighters get killed by these things because you're running a power tool or a saw or a piece of equipment, and it comes down, and oftentimes you have ear protection, you don't hear it, and it kills folks. But what we have here is, look at that. This is all punky wood, meaning it has no structure. It's almost the consistency of, as I might say, like a cork. Very, very soft and powdery. Just, there's nothing there, no strength. When you cut one of these down, you can feel it. You can feel as soon as you put your bar in, there's just nothing there. It's just like going into sawdust. And then the only wood holding this together was on one side and right here. So that whole tree was being supported by this one little section right there, which is probably, what, maybe 5-6% of what it was what it would require, or what it had originally. That's super interesting. If we look here, we'll see that it's riddled with holes. Right there. Bark beetles were in here and they killed it. And it just died a slow death here. I didn't even realize this one was here until Mrs. W told me it was down. I guess in the next episode, we'll be doing kind of an opposite of what we did 2 weeks ago with the old-fashioned, or cutting fire with the old-fashioned way with the buck saw. Speaking of buck saw, have you seen the Dinty Moore stew commercials? They've been out for a couple years now, but that just jarred my memory. There is one of them. So here's the prompt. It's hilarious. So are you familiar with this? These hipsters. There's a bunch of them in Portland. They call themselves lumbersexuals. Maybe it's not even a thing anymore, but I think it is, because last time I went back there, they're still wearing their plaid shirts, and they're wearing. They try to make themselves look like old Pacific Northwest loggers, but they don't know anything. I mean, they're hipsters. They hang out at coffee shops, and they're bike messengers primarily. So there's this series of commercials. So the Dinty Moore guys are put a casting call out, and it's like, hey, we need these strong, these logger types to come in. We're going to be shooting these commercials. So all these hipsters come in, and they assign them these simple tasks to see if they can perform. And the camera's running. For example, they've got a big log, like a fur round there, and they've got a big, like, competition crosscut saw, which is hard to run for a strong guy that's used to it, and they can't even pull it. And one of them's got these funny little pointy shoes that they wear, and he's got his foot. It's freaking hilarious. Anyway, I digress. So years ago, we did a Bible study, and a day doesn't go by. I continue to ask about that. How come we don't do that anymore, and why? Is there something that we could do in the future? How could we do it? It puts a lot of people's nose out of joint, and I don't care about that. There's a lot of things that people do that I don't particularly agree with, or lifestyles that I wouldn't particular practice. But the way I look at it now is I don't cast any judgments. I just prefer not to do it. And you have every right to do whatever you want to do. It's called free will. I don't want you to impose mine, and I certainly won't oppose yours. So, and the same thing applies to people of faith. They're talking about it. So I'm trying to figure out how I can do it in a way that doesn't become drudgery, and and also we don't want to offend folks either. And that's not everyone's thing. And if it's not your thing, I get that 100%. To me, it's vital. I wouldn't have a channel, wouldn't have a family, wouldn't have anything if it wasn't for this. It's been my anchor through tough times in life. So folks will say, well, what if you're wrong? What if everything you believe isn't true? Well, I'm no worse off. But what if you're wrong? And what if everything that I believe is true? What is the penalty then? So that's always kind of the way I looked at it. So what I would, here's my problem, is that I'm a person of extremes, as my friend in the comments, 10-Speed, pointed out. And that comment, I've thought about that a lot lately. I'm like, yeah, I really do get my teeth into stuff, and I get excited about it. But the problem with that, and the drive that comes from that, the flip side of it is that when you're not into it and you get tired of it, and I get tired of stuff quickly, then you don't want to do it at all, and it becomes a drudgery. So it's that, it's that being a person of extremes has its benefits, but it also, which are really, really high, but it also has its negatives, which are really, really low. That's why we have this inside joke, in our family between Mrs. W and I, and she's like, I'm a Honda, and you're a Ferrari. And what she means by that is that when you're performing and at tip top and everything is good, you just can't be beat. You can do anything. But on the downside, we're looking at a high-strung Italian racing car. It oftentimes has problems and probably spends more times down not running than it does running. So her, is more of an even-keeled, constant person. So I have to be careful, and I know this about myself, of starting projects or whatever, that I have to really count those costs. Are you willing to see this through? Can you see this through before some other shiny thing pops up in your life and gets your attention and you run off to that? Because that's kind of the way it is. But it's the way I am, and there's no sense in trying to change it now, right? So the Bible study thing, for me, that's what kind of happened, is I'd get really excited to get into it, and then as when the hard work set in, then, not so much. Miss W always jokes, someday you're going to be a pastor. I'm like, no, I don't want to be a pastor. I don't want to deal with those poor old women and be stuck in the same little place or the same little church. I would rather be like an evangelist that could come into town and get everyone all stirred up and then leave the wreckage onto someone else to deal with and go on and stir up more problems. Can't you picture that? That's what I would like to do. So how do I do this? Have this shotgun approach of a ministry, shotgun. So here's what I came up with. I'm rambling. I'm ranting here. So the thing that I asked myself, what do you like to do? Because for me, to be able to do this and to share it with you guys and do it and do it together, do it right, I've got to be into it, and I've got to be interested. It's got to really arouse my passions, and I have to be careful, because what I'm passionate about today may not be what I'm passionate about next week, right? So I'm thinking, so we have we have a Sabbath school at our church that I enjoy going to before the service, and it's a group of older folks that are really, really know their books. We go to an Adventist church, and Adventists in the old days were called people of the book, because they know their Bible. They know it inside and out. They know it very well, especially the older ones. So I enjoy this older class because we're talking about people that are very, very, no one's going to con them. They know the book inside and out. But the fun thing with that sort of people is you can belong to a group for so long, and you create a bubble around you, and everyone understands kind of you get basically what you get is lazy. No one's challenging you to defend your beliefs. Because if you're going to say that I'm a Christian, or I believe in a God, or I believe in this or that, you need to be able to give a logical, intelligent reason for this belief, right? Not that, well, that's because I was raised that way, or that's because that's what my granny taught me, or because what this particular charismatic guy at the church says, and so I hadn't really thought about it too much. I just figure he knows what he's talking about, right? There won't be any coattails in the kingdom. You're not going to be riding in on any coattails. You're going to be judged according to your own life and your own works. It's a fearful and terrible thing to think about it. So how can I run this in a way that appeals to me? So one thing that I've never tired of is I've never tired of going to these Sabbath school classes with these older learned folk and twisting some tails. And I don't mean to be antagonistic or twist tails. I mean, it's a bit of a joke, but I like to answer all the questions, or I like to propose the discussion or steer it in a direction into more controversial subjects in the Bible, things that are hard to explain, things that portray God in some people's eyes in a bad light. For example, the funny thing that we do is that we have these difficult things that we can't really get our head around, that maybe look to be contradictory. And so instead of taking them head on, most of us kind of just push them away. Well, we won't visit that part of it. I mean, for example, in your church, when is the last time you've heard of a sermon on the Levite and his concubine? Can you remember ever hearing a sermon on that? Well, why not? Why do we preach sermons on some things, but other things that are not convenient or maybe do not, to the casual reader, portray God or Christians as a whole in a positive light? We put those away, and we actually give those things to the children. Right? So what do you do so what do we see in children's books? We have these fantastic stories, right? We've got stories of Noah's Ark, and we've got stories of David and Goliath, and we've got stories of Jonah and the great fish, and maybe even stories of Gideon, maybe Samson that killed, 1,000 men with the jawbone of an ass. So all of these things that are so fantastic and very difficult to explain and to understand, we don't deal with those. We pass those off and give them to the children and hope that they can understand it. So we're teaching them about a loving God that loves the little children, Jesus meek and mild. And then we see some of the things that some of the heroes of the Bible did that weren't quite so nice, to say the least. And we give those stories to the children and let them puzzle and let them deal with them. Well, we ourselves don't have the courage to take them on ourselves and try to unravel what does this mean, right? So the perfect example, I was reading this morning in my own time, I was reading about this story in the New Testament, it's the book of Acts, Ananias and Sapphira. So just to put it into context really quickly, if you don't know the story. So Jesus had recently been crucified. We had this large group of people. He was coming into Jerusalem. They were all expecting him to make himself king. He was going to kick the Romans out. He was going to reestablish Israel. And these folks were stoked because they were on the ground floor, right? You know, the Amway, the multi-level marketing, you know, all those stories of, oh, if you could have got in on the ground floor, you know, you'd be at the top of the pyramid, you'd be making millions, right? Well, these folks were not unlike that. They were thinking, you know, I might just be, if Jesus is going to be king, I might be Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, or I might be treasurer, or who knows what. This is what they were talking about, the Last Supper, right? So it was really a body blow to the early church when Jesus was crucified on the cross, and all of their hopes were dashed. And so the church was really in a state of confusion at this time, and many people had seen the miracles, and many people had actually heard Christ speak, but there's some confusion going on. There's some questions, and there's some real strong soul searching. It must have been a tremendous disappointment. Tremendous disappointment. So here we have the early church is starting to gather. I'm sure that they were probably gathering at, you know, maybe someone had a big house or in that. So one of the guys, one of the early members of the church, the apostles, was it Barnabas? Barnabas, I forget. Doesn't matter. He sold some land and gave the proceeds to the church. Was he asked to do this? Well, there's no record of that. He was feeling magnanimous, or maybe he saw a need. Maybe the early church, they were trying to support the ministry. So the guys, the original apostles, the 11 that were left, could maybe they were raising money for them to take care of their needs while they were out spreading the gospel, right? Who knows, right? So there are some folks in the church that watch this transgression, and I would imagine that this was quite a thing. I mean, you come in and let's say, you know, the modern day is you'd sold a piece of property for $250,000 and you'd taken that sum in cash, and you walk into a Sunday service, a Sabbath service, right, and you plop that $250,000 down the offering plate. Well, can you imagine the adoration of the followers? Can you imagine those people who had never seen anything like that before? They must have held him in very high esteem, right? So we have Ananias and Sapphira that were probably sitting in that congregation watching this, and they thought to themselves, man, we'd like to have a little bit of that credibility. They're treating this guy like a first-class citizen. You know, look what he did. Yeah, as if by doing something, you know, we can't buy our salvation. But this is the way that people think, right? So they came up with a scheme themselves. Ananias and Sapphira were husband and wife. They sold a piece of land. They conspired together to keep some of it, we don't know how much, but to keep a little bit back for themselves, you know, just in case, just to be prudent. I mean, what's wrong with selling a piece of land and keeping a portion to yourself and giving some to the church or what have you? That's not a big deal, right? Well, what they did is they came in and they wanted, because of their pride, they wanted to have those, the adoration of the congregation, and probably of the, Peter himself was right there. Right there, one of the very apostles that spent 3.5 years with Christ, right? So they want to impress him. They want to sit in the good seats up front because they were big donors, right? So the problem that they made is they came in and they lied about it. And Peter, he must have been given, you know, he had some sort of a divine gift or ability to discern what was going on. Asked them a question. So is this all of the money that you got from selling that plot? And Ananias is there by himself, and he's like, yeah, that's it. We give you the whole amount. Well, Peter knew, and right there in front of the entire congregation, Peter exposed him. And the fascinating thing about this is that Ananias, it says, breathed his last and fell down right there in front of the whole congregation, dead on the church floor in front of Peter. Did Peter kill him? Did Peter have like superpowers from God to be able to do something like that? You know, it doesn't say. We know that Peter didn't pronounce a death sentence. All we know is Ananias breathed his last and lay there on the church floor. So what do you think is going through the minds of the congregation, right, at this time? So here we have Ananias. He's sitting on the church. He's dead on the church floor. The young men come out, and they start digging a hole to put him in a grave, right? Do you imagine that offerings were up that day? You suppose when they passed the plate after Ananias fell dead on the church floor for holding back, do you think that anyone else held back? I mean, would that not help our cause? Would that help the church if, maybe once every 3 or 4 or 5 years, one of the saints falls dead on the church floor, and you think offerings would go? It would be an effective way to fundraise for the church, would it not? But the problem with that is that why would you be serving? Why would you serve? Why would you be giving? Because you wanted to be kind? Because you felt led by the Holy Spirit to do it? Or that you were doing it hoping that you wouldn't be the next victim, hoping that you could assuage a vengeful and angry God by giving these coins or these trinkets? It's an interesting question. It's rarely talked about. It's rarely preached about on the sermon because it brings up very difficult questions. And what type of a God would enjoy his created beings? How much could you really enjoy someone serving you if they served you out of fear? Right? The old example that I always use. Let's say I have 12 kids. Right? One of them, the youngest, Tommy, has disobeyed. Continued to disobey. I've warned him. He won't, but he continues to do it. I take all the children with my wife and my 12 kids, and I single Tommy out, and I stand him up against the old tree. I pull out my pistol, and I shoot him dead in the forehead. He falls dead on the ground. Then I look to the other 11 and say, so now, are you going to obey me? What are they going to say? Yes, Father. We're going to obey you. Not one of us are going to go against anything you say. And what if I were to take it a little bit further and say, now tell me you love me. Do you love me, children? Oh, yes, Daddy, we love you. We love you very much, especially with that 45 in your hand. What would it mean to me in the preceding days or hours or minutes when I went up to one and my daughter and asked her and wanted to receive that true love, that true affection that comes only from beings with free will? Would it be meaningless to me knowing that she's only doing this out of fear of retaliation from me or to protect her own life? Her heart is not in it. And it's going to, and if it continues, it's going to breed not love and respect and admiration, but contempt and hatred. So how many of us, how many folks are reading these old stories, maybe not understanding the context and walking away and saying, well, that's pretty scary stuff, and I'll go ahead and do what it says, not because my heart's in it, talking about the 66 books, but because I fear the consequence. Is that a friendship? Do we not hear all the time about God spoke to Moses as a man speaks to his friend? Do we not see time and time again that that's ultimately what God wants is a friendship, a relationship? Not cowering servants that are going through the rotes, going through the motions, hoping to prevent themselves from meeting a judgment someday. Or even worse, for people who have completely given up altogether because by reading these stories and not understanding that they are set in the remedy, that they never get that far and look back upon those things and say, there's no benefit to this, and I wouldn't serve a God like this that treats his children so poorly. There are things that God has commanded people to do in the Old and New Testament that are things that are worse and things that you wouldn't even do to your own enemies. So you've got to ask yourself this question. So it doesn't surprise me that intellectuals or people, learned people, scoff at so many Christians because we as a group have been lazy and for most of us, I think we're unable to defend the things that we claim is most important to us. We can't make those arguments. So I would like to do something that would address that. Maybe it's just a matter of me going through and trying to find the worst things that have happened and some of the evils that have been, at face value, not to be irreverent, that have been brought down upon man from God, because ultimately the buck stops with him, right? Isn't that what the sign that was it Harry Truman had on his desk when he was president? The buck stops here. Meaning that, yeah, my chief of staff or my, I may have a lowly lieutenant or a captain or someone that makes a terrible mistake and lives were lost or something horrible happened. What he was saying by having that sign was that I ultimately am responsible. I'm not going to pass the buck. I'm not going to pass it off to someone else. Whether or not he did that, I don't know. But that's what the sign said. But we have to, ultimately, it all comes back to God as well. So I would like to, let me know in the comments what you think, how we could do this. Maybe we just do something like I did today. Off the cuff, we just, I'll go through and like, okay, this is something I don't understand, and let's break it down and see if we can find out, and asking one question, the whole thing, what is this telling us about God? What does it tell us about God that two people fall dead on the church floor, Ananias and Sapphira, yet he allows some folks chance after chance after chance, like King David, what King David did, was it not worse than what Ananias and Sapphira did? And what about Achan and his family and all of his animals and his children and all those? That's another difficult story. Yeah, I don't know. I'd like to be able to do something. I don't know if it should be on this channel, if it should be little tidbits at the end of videos, or it should be on another channel. I don't know. Let me know in the comments, and we'll see what we could put together. But I think it's something that I could do, and I don't know that we'd have any particular upload date, but we could at least kind of get a roadmap. Okay, let's pick these 10 things. These are really tough stories. Let's dig into them and see if we can find out what it is, what's about, why is it in there? Because if it's in 66 books, that's pretty precious real estate. Why was it so important for the story of the Levite and his concubine to be put in there? Why was it so important, the transgressions of Samson or King David? Why were those things important? They must have a reason. There must be some lesson in there. And I think that as thinking people, we need to know what those are. All right, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys on the next video.